Kenya's debt crisis continues to grow to alarming proportions. The country is tinkering on the verge of a debt crisis. What is the way forward? Well, on this KTN News Special Edition, we shall be focusing on what are the mitigation measures that the country needs to pursue in order to manage her debt levels. I'll be speaking to a very interesting panel that will be shedding light into this all-important subject, even as the President made his address today, focusing on some of the key issues that continue to bedevil the economy, from matters to do with corruption to installing transparency in our operations as a country. Well, this is a KTN News Special. My name is Abi Agina, and I'll be speaking to my panelists. I'll be introducing them shortly. And remember, you can be part of this conversation by sharing and tweeting at KTN News KE, and you can also catch us on our various platforms. Let me begin by quickly introducing our panelists who are joining us from multiple locations. First off, we have Wanjiru Gikonyo. Wanjiru Gikonyo is from the TISA, and she is the national coordinator. She is passionate about promoting citizen-led accountability and has been at the front line of promoting participatory democracy. Wanjiru is also very keen on devolved governance in Kenya and has over 15 years' experience in the promotion of citizen-led accountability as an advocate for constitutionalism. Wanjiru has been on the forefront of a number of landmark public interest cases, including the Constituency Development Fund case and the cases challenging the illegal transfer of Nairobi County functions. Well, let's get to our second guest. We have Mr. James Muraguri. He is a public finance practitioner with over 15 years' experience in the non-profit sector. He is the founder and CEO of the Institute of Public Finance Kenya. James is a founding board member of People Powered, a global non-profit alliance that seeks to strengthen participatory democracy. He is also a member of the International Advisory Group for Public Finance by Women, a foundation working to promote true gender equality and equal career opportunities for women working in public finance. And last but not least, actually our third guest, we have Irene Otieno. She is an advocate of the High Court. She is involved in promoting good governance and tax justice in Kenya. With more than 10 years' experience in development work, Irene is a governance, public sector management and public sector reform advocate. Her work interests are on the empowerment of citizenry through the provision of accurate information and citizens raising their voice to demand accountability. Well, to my last guest, and this is Mr. Leonard Wanyama. Leonard Wanyama is the coordinator for the East Africa Network Tax and Governance Network. He specializes in international relations in East Africa. Having consulted with the Royal United Services Institute, he has also worked as a magazine columnist for the Nairobi Law Monthly and Nairobi Business Monthly, and as a part-time lecturer of international relations at the Technical University of Kenya and Riara University, respectively. All right, that is the cocktail of guests we have to help us steer this conversation forward. But before we engage them, let's take you down some very interesting numbers that will leave you gobsmacked. Well, Kenya's debt evolution, public debt, as of June 2020, our domestic debt stands at 3.1 trillion shillings. Whereas our external debt is at a whopping 3.5 trillion shillings. This takes up our total debt to 6.6 trillion shillings. Well, as of 2018, our domestic debt stood at 2.4 trillion shillings and our external debt stood at 2.5 trillion shillings. This taking our total debt to 5.03 trillion shillings. Well, moving back to 2016, our domestic debt was standing at 1.8 trillion shillings, whereas our external debt was at the similar number, taking up the total debt to 3.6 trillion shillings of public debt. Well, far back in the hands of time, let's take you back to June 2013. This is when the Jubilee administration took over office. Our domestic debt was standing at 1.05 trillion shillings, whereas our external debt was at 0.8 trillion shillings. And this gives us a sense of where we are, and our total debt as of 2013 was at 1.8 trillion shillings. In essence, our debt has more than tripled to now hit 6.6 trillion Kenyan shillings. Well, that is a quick look at the numbers, which will be shaping our discussion as we progress with this conversation. All right, and like I did mention, our guests for this conversation are raring to go. And let me just kick it off with Ms. Wanjiru Gikonyo. Of course, a lot of expectations from Kenyans when it comes to public accountability. But from where you sit, we are in an interesting period in our economy, and this continues to define the route ahead. Well, Madam Gikonyo, the Okoa Uchumi campaign has kicked off in earnest. Many Kenyans are trying to understand what is the narrative behind this. All right, we need you to unmute kindly, Madam Gikonyo.
Apologies. Thank you.
Please proceed.
Right. Okoa Uchumi really is trying to go beyond the numbers of debt because behind those numbers there are a number of fundamental questions. Number one is, what did that money do in service to Kenyans? Because we are not opposed to debt. We know government must borrow, but when it borrows, it has to do so in line with the Constitution, which requires accountability and participation and prudent use of the resources. So what did that money do? That's part of our concern regarding with the debt. The other issue is Article 1, which vests sovereignty in the people of Kenya. Mm-hmm. And coming from civil society, there are civil society institutions, including those that are here and others who are part of the coalition, who work very hard to ensure that citizens engage in the budget process, giving submissions to Parliament, giving submissions to Treasury, doing reviews, and we are not seeing a response by our political leaders. So the Okoa Uchumi Coalition is civil society coming together to join arms with the media, because media has been talking about the debt problem for a long time now. Ever since it got very alarming 3 years ago or something, media has been reporting, and other civil society have been monitoring. But we said, let us come together, the finance experts, such as James Muraguri, the experts who are working with Parliament in oversight, such as the National Taxpayers Association. Leonard Wanyama is representing the East Africa region because there is a dynamic, and there are others who do budget monitoring, who do anti-corruption work. So the aim of the coalition is, one, to bring civil society together so that we can deal with this problem that is undermining services to the people of Kenya and the sustainability of our development, so that we can offer solutions, demand accountability, and push for political accountability of those who have violated our laws for their own benefit in the misuse of public debt. So that is what the Okoa Uchumi Coalition seeks to do, and we've had a number of engagements, and this is our first public engagement, so to speak, which signals the launch, us getting out there, getting our voice there, planning to engage with international lenders, planning to engage with Treasury, planning to engage with Parliament, oversight institutions, and most importantly, to put citizens back in the center of public finance management issues as anticipated by the Constitution and in line with international best practice.
All right, thank you so much, Madam Wanjiru. Let me bring in Mr. Muraguri. And clearly, this campaign is out to ensure that there is participation by Kenyans and East Africans at large. And when we look at the numbers that I highlighted earlier, from where you sit as an accountant and someone with background in finance, should we be worried about our debt sustainability?
Thank you very much. So debt sustainability, we must also look at it from given thresholds based on those who lend money to Kenya. Kenya is still a very ideal candidate for lending money, by those who have the money, because we are not yet defaulting. But it's dangerous because we have breached the recommended threshold. For example, we look at the resources that we are putting, our debt servicing costs, against the export ratio. We are at 38% against an IMF recommended threshold of 21%. But more importantly, when you think about debt sustainability, it's also the question around looking at who pays the debt. It's the citizens. And in the midst of a COVID pandemic, then you're also looking at, is government meeting, the COVID, pandemic, head on with the resources that we have available? Of course, no. In a country where we are struggling with isolation beds, for example, then it means the resources that we are putting on paying, for debt, which could have been productive debt and unproductive debt, because we're not saying all debt is unproductive.
Exactly.
There is productive debt and unproductive debt.
Okay.
But then when you take in terms of COVID crisis, then of course you see that leads to a crisis because the government cannot meet the social contract between the citizen and the government.
And if I got you correctly, you're saying we've already surpassed the threshold. And what does this mean for common mwananchi? Should they be worried that they are going to pay this debt for many years to come? Whereas, like when Madam Wanjiru said earlier, debt is not a bad thing because you borrow to finance something that will bring productive results in the economy.
Absolutely. Like I said, we should be worried as citizens, this debt. Because the thing is, first of all, it's a disclosure levels on what debt are we paying for. First of all, you have to ask what debt is this that we are paying for, and how much money are we putting in debt, and how much money are we putting for service delivery. Mm-hmm. Those are the things that citizens should be worried around. That within that matrix. So we are saying, how much money are we collecting as a country? Yeah. How much money are we putting for, for servicing debt, and which debt is this that we are paying? And that's where the worry should be. And of course, looking at, is our economy growing at the same level as our debt is growing? All right. That should be something to worry about.
Very insightful comments there, Mr. Muraguri. Let me bring in Madam Irene Otieno. Of course, for us to be able to finance our development, we need to collect taxes. And for us to get the taxes, the Kenyans have to pay to the tax authorities. From your interactions, especially with where we are as a country, just hearing the previous speakers raising the red flag that we are over-borrowing. We are standing at about a debt of 6.6 trillion shillings, and clearly the Kenya Revenue Authority has been having it difficult meeting the revenue targets.
Thanks, Abi, and colleagues who are on this call and very important discussion. So indeed, as has rightfully been said, our debt has been on the increase for quite a long time. But as a concern majorly for citizens is what is really pushing the debt. So what are we financing? What is the expenditure like? So that has been a key concern for we as taxpayers in a sense. So a lot of it has been pointed out as a lot of recurrent and a lot of inefficiencies, even in the budgets that we are passing. So over the years, you notice, Abby, that the budget has been increasing. So increasing without justification of the cost. So I think it is a time that we as a country, and particularly Parliament, interrogates budgets before approving it. Are we just adding funding to each department and ministry that is pushing for an increase in their budget? Or are we querying the rationale behind the increased budget for each sector? And additionally, also correlating this with the reports from the Office of the Auditor General and the reports from the Controller of Budgets. So I feel that if we address the expenditure bit of the budget, it would give us room then to see the acquisition of debt. Is it rational to then acquire debt, or can we increase efficiency around the expenditure side, and obviously then reduce the need or the urge to take on more debt? And Abby, if you allow, looking again in the last 2 or so years, you will note that the finance acts that the government of Kenya has passed at both county and national level have been finance acts that I would say are very brutal and draconian to the taxpayers. So we are looking at digital taxation, there's new turnover tax. There's a raft of new taxes that are coming, and this is obviously trying to address the issue that we have said, revenues are dipping, and government is constrained to be a good debtor and pay its debts. Mm-hmm. So then the person that is taking the effects, the negative effects of this is the taxpayers who are heavily burdened. But as Shiro has said, then the public services are not strengthened. So I think that is the main concern for taxpayers. It really must be addressed. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Madam Irene. Let me bring in Mr. Leonard Wanyama to also weigh in on this very important subject. And Mr. Wanyama, of course, from the previous speakers, there is a cause for concern looking at our debt numbers. Do you hold the same view? And perhaps what informs your line of thought?
I think, thanks for having me today, and it's very good to have this discussion. And it's also quite opportune moment to consolidate our efforts in terms of speaking about the public finance management that is taking place in the country. So I'd like to congratulate KTN for having this discussion, and also thank my colleagues for coming together on these efforts. Now, I would, of course, support what my colleagues have been saying, because we are teetering on the brink, and as you've heard from my colleague James, who actually looks at the numbers from time to time, he can tell you about how things have been moving to the point of us shifting these thresholds that we have in place. For me, I think the issue that arises, particularly if I look at the regional trends, is how the politics and the policy-making process is taking place. For us, the fact that this debt strain is resulting in us continuing to push the thresholds and not really considering that it's not always a priority to have big budgets, because big budgets do not necessarily mean that money is being used effectively. And so there is a politics and a policy-making process that is also increasingly going under strain. In Kenya, for instance, you have seen how passionate the debate about revenue sharing has played out. Of course, you could have seen also the politics around how that threshold was raised. And so we are actually now straining even the rules that we have put in place in terms of public finance management that would help us effectively deliver services to the citizen. And that is one of the main problems that is emerging. A colleague of ours, that is Kwame Owino of the Institute for Economic Affairs, has actually told us something that we should try and start having conversations to try and maybe convince politicians and the policymakers that having an enormous budget is not necessarily a good thing. In any case, as the budget has been increasing, it has primarily been for two main things. First, to pay our debts. So we increasingly borrow more to pay more debts. So borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. And secondly, other than paying debts, it's increasingly to facilitate the growing wage bill across the board. And so I would support my colleagues' sentiments in this regard in terms of the pressures that not only Kenya but East African countries are feeling with regards to the accumulating debt.
All right. And let me take it back to my panelists. And Madam Wanjiru Gikonyo, how much is too much, considering the fact that the government has maintained its stance, indicating that the current debt situation is still manageable? And are we really at that level of distress where we might foresee a country that is unable to service its debts?
Oh, thank you, Abi. And I'll say immediately that, you know, we have James, who's more of an expert when it comes to the numbers. But I'll tell you my take and my interpretation of it. First of all, the government itself has admitted it's at risk of distress. If you look at the budget review outlook paper that it publishes every year, it said so. It's very ironic because on one hand, they say debt is sustainable. They then say there are these indicators that, you know, that James mentioned that are given, and they are those measures that are given, and government will say, well, they're still within one of them. They've now breached, I think they've breached 2 or maybe even 3 of them out of 4. And then they say it's sustainable, but then they say they're at the risk of debt distress, and then they overestimate the revenue that they expect to collect in the year, and inevitably what happens is that they'll have to borrow. So what we are having is we have a public finance system, like as Leonard was saying, that tries to guide government it tries to guide the Treasury, which is supposed to advise the executive, and Parliament, which is supposed to then oversee the executive and tell them, no, the arguments or the basis for the proposals you're given are not founded. So this process has completely broken down, and government is publishing in its reports information that's inconsistent, and some of it is misleading. And Parliament actually, at the beginning of this year, before the COVID, the Budget Committee had sanctioned the CS of Treasury and said, we don't have enough information around debt. You're not telling us what the debt is for. We then, of course, have had COVID, as James said. And you expect with COVID, 1.2 million people, this was as at June, had lost their jobs. Official people who are unemployed on account of lost their jobs, livelihoods on account of COVID. We also have businesses that have been forced to shut down. We also have the health pandemic that we are responding to, and Kenya doesn't spend enough on health.
Sure.
We are supposed to be spending about 15% of the budget. We spend about 6% of the budget, and we do so quite inefficiently because Irene talked about inefficiencies. And these inefficiencies are actually masked. A lot of it is what we saw with the COVID funds. There's corruption. So how can Parliament that's supposed to represent citizens allow a government that is borrowing to pay debt? We are paying 1 trillion of 1.6, 1.4 trillion expected to be collected. 1 trillion is going to debt repayment. Yet we are signing more agreements in the last, since COVID, for new debt for new projects. Mm-hmm. So our problem we have a problem where our politicians are not mindful of the needs of citizens. And we need to speak out. We need, you can see the intimidation of the courts that has gone on because the courts have taken action. But we have some cases that have been in court that have not been resolved because the courts are also now under pressure from the executive. So we have a problem. And for us, we recognize as a coalition, it's a political problem. We have a law, there is no compliance, we have a political problem, and citizens are part of the political infrastructure. And we must exercise ourselves and push back because we elect these leaders, they need to account to us. And the last thing I'll say is...
Make it brief. We need to go on a quick commercial break. Just keep it under 30 seconds, please.
World Bank recommends that investments in infrastructure should be about 4.5% of GDP for a country to grow. The SGR cost Kenya 4.5% of GDP. So you know, if you put that in context, you realize we've been extremely imprudent, and we believe corruption is driving that, as Irene said.
All right. Thank you so much, Madam Wanjiru Gikonyo. And clearly, we are making a lot of headway with this discussion. I can see a lot of feedback on social media streaming in. And of course, our question on this forum was, do you think Kenya's debt load is still sustainable? So far, from the feedback we have, 14.8% are saying our debt burden is over the roof, whereas 85.2% do not think our debt burden is sustainable, raising pertinent questions into this particular focus area. When you want to go on a quick commercial break, when we come back, we'll be looking at the options for the country. What are some of the solutions? Should debt relief be one of the solutions on the table? We'll be discussing this with my panelists. Don't go too far.
This is KTN News.